We're now recording again. Vera is a student at Cork University, and she's going to be talking to us about understanding how and why we travel towards improving representation, transport demand management, and modal shift in energy system models. Vera, are you?
Hi, Max. Yeah, sure. Just a minute now, and I can share screen here. So, can everyone see that there?
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint. It's not quite full screen yet.
Oh yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction there. So, as mentioned, I will be talking about how and why we travel, improving representations of transport demand management, and modal shift in energy systems models. So my name is Vera O'Riordan. I'm part of the Energy Policy and Modelling Group, and this work was produced in collaboration with Tomás McClure, Dr. Fionn Rogan, Professor Brian O'Gallagher, and Dr. Hannah Daly as part of the Capacity Project. So linking into the conference theme, why is improving representation of passenger transport, demand management, and modal shift in energy systems models so important? And really what it can do is show how much can public transport infrastructure reduce transport CO2 emissions, how much cycling infrastructure reduce transport CO2 emissions, look at the reason why we travel in order to formulate purpose-based policy to reduce traffic in the built environment, and understand the difficulty with decarbonisation of longer journeys and the issues with decentralised planning and urban sprawl. So without proof for policymakers, alternative ideas get forgotten about. And as mentioned in the keynote, electric vehicles are widely mentioned, but also more alternative looks at biomass and also modal shift here and demand management, what we're chatting about, will be really important for our low carbon passenger transport transition. And the focus of this study as well will be focusing on Ireland, but there's a lot of great learnings, I think, for other countries as well from this presentation. So honing into Ireland, we have committed to a 51% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for Ireland by 2030 compared to 2020. And that's about a 7% per year reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And we've recently issued our programme for government and our climate action plan, which has targets for sustainable technologies and public services and low carbon schemes, which is great in theory, but what do these mean in terms of megatons of CO2 saved in practice? And this is what we aim to find out. And the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and as well the Environmental Protection Agency here in Ireland, has set out this best practice avoid, shift, and then improve procedure and framework for planning transport in Ireland and for a low carbon transport transition as well. So it's really important first to look at how we can avoid and reduce the need for travel, and then look at strategies for shifting modes, and then finally looking at improving efficiency. And when looking at energy systems modelling, particularly in Ireland, or even just historically, there has been a huge emphasis on the improve aspect. So this really is looking at how we can improve car transport through fuel efficiency and electric vehicles. And this was done initially through the Irish car stock model in the Irish case, where we had great information on car transport in Ireland. And then what we do is set up scenarios focusing on changing the fuel efficiencies, the fuel technologies, and looking at emissions bands to see how we could change annual CO2 emissions, change the stock carbon intensity, and look at tax revenues as a result. But what we want to do now is push beyond that and look at modal shift and demand management. So that's why we introduce the Irish Passenger Transport Emissions and Mobility Model. And this includes inputs from the Irish car stock model, which provides great information about vehicle kilometres travelled by cars, but also we incorporate it and spread it wider to include all modes of transport, walking, cycling, bus and rail, and looking at why we travel as well through information from the National Travel Survey. And I know as well the UK has a similar National Travel Survey also, which looks at the purpose for travel and the modes of transport throughout the country. So we use this to get a broader look at energy consumption across all the different mode types, the occupancies of all these different forms of transport, and looking at the CO2 emissions by mode, the total CO2 emissions, and the carbon intensity for every passenger kilometre that we travel. We then use this as part of a wider energy systems simulation platform called LEAP, and this allows for exploratory climate action targets to be applied in our simulation model for scenario analysis, and we can construct pathways for low carbon transport and provide some insights for carbon budgets for the 2020 to 2030 period. So as you can see from left to right here, we go from identifying the targets, developing our transport data, using our analysis platform LEAP, adapting scenario analysis, and then having insights for carbon budgets. And we've looked historically at what has been going on for passenger transport in Ireland. And you can see from 2009 to 2019, really the majority of passenger kilometres are met with car transport. And in 2019, 82% of all distance travelled by passengers was met by private car transport. Only 1% was met by cycling and walking. And this really was the first time where we could get a holistic view of total passenger kilometres travelled, incorporating trip distances and trip purposes. And it helped us see that we hadn't met our initially set 2009 Smarter Travel Policy Document target of 10% cycling by 2019. This would have made us similar in comparison to the cycling culture in the Netherlands. And really, this
what did you do now, my blue white son?
Helps us realise how far we are from realising our targets. As well, we had a look at passenger transport demand by trip purpose based on the National Travel Survey, and also our Irish car stock model and public transport providers. We see here that the main three reasons for travel are work, shopping, and companion escort journeys, where other people are giving other people spins, or giving other people lifts, apologies. So you can see here that this would be interesting or useful to develop scenarios for purpose-based policy incentives, such as remote working, which we'll discuss later. So currently, most short journeys could be met by active modes, but you also need to realise how far we are travelling in order to decide what could be a potential pathway for low carbon transport. It wouldn't be possible, perhaps, to reduce or involve modal shift to active modes of travelling, such as walking or cycling, for journeys greater than 20 kilometres, for example. And this model factors that in. We also have information on occupancy rates for modes of transport in Ireland based on our calculations. And as you can see, it goes from the best performing Irish rail transport, which is the heavy rail transport in Ireland, to private vehicles, which have an occupancy of about 1.5 persons. And we have no clear active mode targets either. So we explore 7 possible pathways, which are described here and are shown in our results later. We also looked at public transport scenarios based on Ireland's Climate Action Plan, where we looked at a bus rapid transit system for the capital, the electrification of rail, also the impacts of a hybrid rail fleet, and the extension of a light rail line in the capital of Ireland. We also looked at remote working scenarios based on Ireland's Climate Action Plan, looking at what a 2-day work from home, what a 5-day work from home, and what targets set out by the programme for government with the civil service working from home would look like. So for carbon budgeting, what are the potential greenhouse gas emission savings from these particular measures? We can see here from our active modes of travel targets that all these different targets, taken from various different government policy documents, can actually achieve different outcomes. And this is currently a blind spot in our policy making process. That we have set these targets, but we don't actually know what they mean in terms of megatons of CO2 emissions reduction. And here we attempt to paint that picture. So as you can see, for example, Setting a target of 10% of work and education passenger kilometres only achieves 0.3 megatons of CO2 savings. But if we reach or aim for the target of 450,000 trips per day being met by active modes of travel, we can save up to 1 megaton of CO2. And for context, in Ireland, passenger transport is responsible for between 6 and 7 megatons of CO2. So this is quite a significant reduction compared to 2020 current emissions from passenger transport. And when we look at all the other scenarios mentioned, from active modes to electrification of rail, with Dublin Bus Connects, and also looking at the remote working scenarios, you can see that we can save a range of emission savings, but we still have a gapped target of 2 to 4 megatons of CO2. So perhaps this could be met by combining our electric vehicle and biofuel targets under the Biofuel Obligation Scheme. And these are part of our climate action plan. But now we have an insight into what modal shift scenarios and demand reduction scenarios have for low carbon passenger transport. So in conclusion, we see that significant additional measures are required to meet the higher mitigation ambition. And the current measures in the Climate Action Plan do not achieve, some of them, a significant reduction in emissions. They help, but that's not all that we need to do. And private car transport is the most common transport mode in Ireland. And while this might be helpful for electric vehicle or biofuel transitions, perhaps it could also mean that many more journeys could be via public transport or active modes. There's also a scope for electric bikes to extend the potential for longer car trips to be replaced. And also, when combining all these different scenarios together, the policy measures and the impacts they have may be less than the sum of the emission savings due to interaction effects. So, for example, if we have a better bus transportation system and more cycling, bus transport modes and cycling may be in competition with one another, and the net CO2 emission savings would be less. This is an area that we are currently looking into. So looping back to the purpose of these transport models, they will help the built environment because we can see now how public transport, cycling, and how demand reduction targets could potentially help reduce passenger transport CO2 emissions. And without proof for policymakers, these alternative ideas may be forgotten about. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my presentation. And my contact details are there below if you wish to ask me a question. I'm also looking forward to the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera. I'm sure there'll be plenty of interesting questions to follow in the Q&A following the next two presentations. Next, we've got Wanda Barsic from the International Energy Research Centre, who's going to talk to us about enabling collective actions in communities to accelerate energy transition.
Hi everyone, thanks, but could you please just turn off the sharing mode so I can share my screen?
There.
Thanks. Can you see?
Yes, can see, yeah.
Oh, just from the beginning. Good. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present Upstairs project. So my name is Wanda Barsic, and I'm working as a research assistant at International Energy Research Center in IRC, which is an industry-led collaborative center in the field of integrated sustainable energy systems and jointly funded by the Irish government and industry members. Currently, we are working on several projects considering the residential and commercial sector, energy demand sector, peer-to-peer energy trading, system integration, blockchain, storage solutions, energy communities, and collective actions, as I will be talking now. So I'm a project lead of the Upstairs project, which stands for Uplifting Communities, Structuring Collective Action for Sustainable Local Transition, and Identifying Regulatory Solutions for Adopting Frontier Technologies and Disruptive Business Models. Project is granted under the Horizon 2020 call building a low carbon, climate resilient future. And under the topic, the role of consumers in changing the market through informed decisions and collective actions. The project's budget is over 2 million euros, and it will last for 3 years. So what are the core objectives? The core objectives are to stimulate the growth of energy communities that can be formed of citizens, households, non-commercial organizations, public entities, and SMEs. To remove the barriers to citizen participation in the transition from a consumer to a prosumer market. To launch a collective action and participation in energy community in private residential buildings. To make informal decisions by identifying the problem, collecting data and information, and through brainstorming, find the possible solutions and alternatives. And to identify and address regulatory barriers. In 2019, European Commission produced Clean Energy Package, which consists of 8 legislative acts mentioning energy communities, where citizens can join their energy and benefit from incentives for renewable energy production. So energy communities are defined in these 2 directives, Internal Market for Electricity Directive and Renewable Energy Directive. But to the most of people, these definitions are not clear. So the UPSERS project will address these differences. Each directive states definition for active and renewable self-consumer, and in both cases, they are final customers or groups of jointly active consumers entitled to generate, consume, store, and sell electricity they have produced within their premises or outside their premises. As a legal entity, they can also be association, cooperative, partnership, NGO, or a SME. Participation is open and voluntary, and everyone can participate. For example, household customers should be allowed to participate voluntarily in these initiatives, as well as to leave them without losing access to the network or losing their rights as consumers. Also, they can switch the supplier without being charged for it. The main differences in these communities are noted in the proximity to the generating installation, to the voting rights, and to the technology used. So in the case of citizen energy community, members or shareholders should not be in direct physical proximity to the generating installation, which this does not apply for renewable energy community. For renewable energy community, you need to be in the direct proximity to the generating installation. For citizen energy community, decisions should be limited to members not involved in large-scale commercial activity, while for a renewable energy community, internal decisions should be based on democratic governance, regardless of members' amount of investment. And the last difference is about technology used. Citizen energy community participate across electricity sector, while renewable energy community focus only on renewable energy. And the generated revenues from these communities activities should be primarily used to provide services to the members, to reduce energy bills, to invest in local initiatives, and to further their activities. So according to these differences, we can easily say that renewable energy communities act as a subgroup to the citizen energy community. UPSERS project will provide a one-stop shop as a single point to all necessary information for energy communities and collective actions. This includes information and advice on energy efficiency and energy conservation solutions, capacity building, energy auditing, finance models for energy retrofit of homes, business models, and lists on policy and regulatory advice specifically tailored for our 5 pilot regions. Every region will generate 5 implementation champions. This will be the persons who will gain all this knowledge I just mentioned, and they will provide support to the energy communities. UPSERS digital platform and mobile application as a support information system will provide decision support services for energy assessment of the community and its potential for local generation or service to the grid. And it will be operated by implementation champion. The platform will also be the main operational and technical information source for the upstairs energy service model framework, specifically tailored for each pilot region. The goal of the project is to train upstairs authorities and implementation champions in 5 pilot countries to deliver the upstairs service model and help SECs, sustainable energy communities, to bridge the barriers they are encountering in setting such a community. There is a lot of issues in like a lack of resources, a lack of finances, lack of expertise, and required knowledge to install and develop this kind of technology. Also, the goal is to help them to help communities to invest in renewable energy technologies, to introduce the word prosumer, who not only produce and consume energy, but actively participate in the energy market, to demonstrate the power of collective action, to establish such a tool and business model that can be replicated to other regions, municipalities, or member states, and to help them bridge the regulatory and legal issues they are encountering. The Upstairs project consists of 11 different organizations, authorities, 1 SME, and municipalities, county councils in Ireland, Bulgaria, Austria, Spain, Germany, Poland, and Latvia. 5 pilot regions are included in order to consider differences in climate, culture, energy policy, and government incentives in those countries. So there is a city of Cork in Ireland, Area Metropolitana de Barcelona in Catalonia, Spain, Runhal, a small region in Bavaria below Munich in Germany, Upper Austria region in Austria, and municipality of Asenograd in Bulgaria. So what will be the key takeaways from this presentation? First will be to accelerate the creation of energy communities in other regions throughout the EU, to support citizens and municipalities in becoming prosumers, to employ a new energy service model framework of one-stop shop, which will support local stakeholders in working together, to stimulate replication in other regions throughout the EU, as the goal of the Upstairs project is to replicate the actions and business models in other municipalities and cities, and beyond the life of the project. Also, what I would like to mention as the last word, awareness and educational campaigns on energy communities, information sessions on climate protection, available renewable technologies, installations, procurement processes, equal rights to the community members, community building through local capacity builders and implementation champions, employment of digital technologies, financial options, and marketing strategies that are all necessary to attract more members and investors in local projects, and that this can establish a common ground for active participation. Thank you very much. That will be all from me.
Thank you, Vanda. Next, we've got Jimmy Gia, who's joining us from the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at Oxford University. Jimmy, would you share your slides?
Thank you very much. And I should probably unmute myself as well. Thank you very much, Max, for the introduction. My name is Jimmy Gia, and I want to talk about some of the work that I'm doing in looking at how we can improve capital decision-making. And specifically, what I am looking at when I think of how to improve decision-making is how do we start comparing what different decisions look like. So within the built environment, if we look at, just ask the question, how can we stay warm in whatever building you're sitting in right now? I can say there's probably a dozen or so different strategies that we can have to have you stay warm. If it's a cold day, we can just as easily sit further away from the table, and that would achieve this outcome. But at the same time, we could also go and build a passive house, and that too would also keep us warm. But yet we can see across all of these different options that we have that they happen at different times, they happen at different durations, different upfront costs, ongoing costs, so on and so forth. So the question is, how do we compare then across all of these different options and be able to understand the performance of these decisions over the course of time? Well, it turns out that we actually have very sophisticated tools to do this already, when it comes to financials. And what we do is we just basically use very well-known financial tools for the last couple hundred years, NPV, net present value, IRR, so on and so forth, that take these operational and capital parameters, put them together, and then convert them into a monetary metric. And that monetary metric, because it's fungible, means that we can now compare all of these non-fungible decision options. Well, I ask the question is, well, wait a minute, climate itself is actually just full of many fungible resource flows, such as electricity, carbon flow, water flow, so on and so forth. What if we could take all of these different options and create a new set of tools that can convert them into one of these other fungible flows and understand how they affect some of these climate indicators? And so for my research, I'm focused specifically on electricity, just to see how we can convert it into one of these. And in order to understand how that financial works, I want to give a brief review of how these financial calculations work. At the very top, when we start making these decisions, such as with the NPVs, the paybacks, and the IRRs, what we're doing is something called specific accounting. And in specific accounting, we're taking the data that's already generated from CapEx and OpEx, and by comparing their time, their duration, so on and so forth, we can come up with basically then these decision priorities. CapEx and OpEx themselves come from the balance sheet and the income statement, or the profit and loss. And balance sheets and income statements are known as general reporting, because basically it's just reporting the OpEx and the CapEx and showing the relationship between the two. How does balance sheets and income statements get generated? Well, that's actually based on something called double entry bookkeeping. And double entry bookkeeping sits on top of journal entries. The journal entries is the accounting transactions of every single thing that happened within the company. So we can think of double entry bookkeeping as basically a relational database that takes all the journal entries and shows us how CapEx and OpEx relate to each other for every single transaction. If we look at how energy is currently being accounted for today, we see that it's basically kind of a mess. Up at specific accounting level, we can calculate embodied energy with life cycle cost analysis, full cycle cost analysis, so on and so forth, or we can calculate operational energy in terms of the disclosure requirements that we see today. But there's many competing standards, and at the end of the day, what we can do is make an embodied energy decision or an operational energy decision, but we can't really combine the two and make a holistic decision with both of them. The reason why is because the existing general entry accounting is a single entry system and not a double entry system. And why is it not double entry? Well, it's because we don't have that connection between the journal entries where the transactions are consuming energy up into what could be that general accounting system. So what if we could make this energy decision system much more like that financial decision system? And in order to do that, we have to start with the basics. We have to look at a double entry system to categorize the energy transactions into embodied and operational, so we can see how the two are related to each other. Well, let me give you a brief history of double entry bookkeeping and where we might be able to start in terms of creating this type of a new system. And really, to start with the history of double entry, we actually have to start with the Babylonians. We have to go back to the invention of counting. And the Babylonians used a system called tabular accounting, which was basically just debits and credits. I had one tablet that was full of all the debts that I owed other people, and I have a second tablet that had all of the credits of what other people owed me. Well, fast forward to the mid in the 1400s, instead of tablets, we now have books, hence bookkeeping, but we still had just debits and credits as books. And Lucia Pacioli, who was a mathematician in the 1400s, is recognized as the first person to write down the math of a double entry system. And inside this double entry system, what he did was he added 5 additional books. He added cash, merchandise, and expense. And the reason why this was important is because within a tabular single entry system, you know how much money is debits and credits, but you actually don't know how much money you have. You don't know your wealth. And back in the day, before double entry, if you wanted to know how much money you had to take an inventory of your currency. You had to go down to the bank and basically count. And that might be okay for you and me as individuals, but when it came to a merchant who was dealing between Florence and Venice and Milan and all of the cities in between, they wanted to know just how wealthy they were. And so the double entry system enabled the calculation of profit and enabled the calculation of wealth. And furthermore, because of that double entry, it gave us a lot of other benefits that we now just simply take for granted, like the traceability, auditability, transparency, comparability, so on and so forth, that the financial system gives us. So if we look at this, what we can see today within energy accounting is fundamentally, we're just looking at usage and consumption, which is the debit, and offsets of that consumption, which is basically the credits. So we can see how this energy system that we have today, energy accounting, is really just a single entry tabular system. We're not able to know how energy is accumulating into embodied energy, and then therefore we can't make these trade-off decisions between operational and embodied. So in order to create an energy double entry system, the first step we have to do is come up with the categories. What are the proper categories before we can start then creating the relational database? And so this is now getting into some of my work of thinking, well, how can we use the financial system as inspiration for creating some of these energy categories? If we look at the assets within the balance sheet, and this is a gross simplification of the assets, but basically here's three key ones, which is cash, inventory, and something known as plant, property, equipment. Cash is just basically things that we can spend today. Inventory is known as an asset whose value is derived from the sale or exchange. So when I sell an asset, when I sell the inventory asset, I get revenue. Plant, property, equipment is asset whose revenue is derived by the use of the asset. So if I'm a real estate owner and I own a property, I'm not generating revenue by selling the building, I'm generating revenue by using the building and renting it out. Same thing if I have a bandsaw or a lathe or a plasma cutter. Those are all PPE, and I generate revenue in its use. Well, we can also think of energy analogies of this, where an energy asset, first of all, I have to have liquidity. So that could be the electricity, the fuel, the diesel, the chemical storage, thermal storage, so on and so forth. But then when I sell a pen and I pass it to the buyer of the pen, the energy that I use to build that pen, to manufacture the pen, is the embodied energy, which is now passed down the supply chain. So in essence, embodied energy exchange might include inventory. And likewise, there's embodied energy in the use of the mechanical equipment inside a factory, use of the structure, such as a passive house, to be able to generate thermal warmth. We can also do the same type of exercise when we look at the P&L. And we can think of the P&L, the financial P&L, as basically the rules of exchange of how the company interacts with the rest of the market. Because after all, revenue is how money enters into the company, and all of the expenses is how money leaves the company. And the balance sheet is how money accrues inside of the company. Well, the P&L is organized by something known as matching. And matching is the notion that transactions should be accounted for and attributed as closely to the revenue generating activity. So if I sold a pen to you today, the cost of manufacturing that pen is very highly associated with the sale. And so I put that at the very top, and that's known as something as cost of goods. But I might own a factory that's making pens. And so the salesperson, the administrator, the financier, the staff people, these are operational expenses that might be shared across an organization. So they're much harder to attribute to the manufacture of that single pen. So those then become operating expenses that are shared across an organization. And likewise, at the end of the year, I might have depreciation, I might be paying taxes, so on and so forth. And those are even further away from the generation of revenue from the pen. So the higher the matching to the revenue, the higher up it goes. Well, within energy, what we can also start doing is categorizing and grouping the different flows based on the type of flows. And within thermodynamics, there's three types of systems: open systems, closed, and isolated. In an open system, there's both energy and mass flow in and out of the system. And closed system, only energy flows. And in an isolated system, there's no flow at all. Well, if we think of all of the transactions that happen financially, some of them are actually based on energy and mass flow. So the cost of goods, which I mentioned earlier, if I sell the pen leaves the system. But at the same time, if I'm disposing trash, that's also mass leaving my system. Or if I'm buying office supplies and consumable, that's mass entering my system. When I look at closed systems, that could use the payment of fuels directly, such as electricity expenses and so on and so forth. But if I hire a consultant and I don't have mass entering into my system, I'm still paying for the energy of that particular consultant. And so we can think of labor and services as indirect flows of that closed system. And at the very end, we have isolated systems, which are transactions that don't enter or leave, but they're just simply balance sheet reconciliations. So line items like depreciation and amortizations fall under that of isolated systems. When we start separating out these categories in terms of how energy flows, we can now do some pretty interesting calculations. And I'm going to show you an example here of how we can compare using a heater to provide thermal warmth or using a passive building to provide thermal warmth. So if we're to basically sketch out these different categories, if we use the heater option, the heater is a piece of equipment. So on the balance sheet, it shows up under PPE. And in order to operate that heater to provide warmth, I need to buy fuel and I need to expend the fuel. And so hence every single month, there's a certain amount of fuel that is providing me with thermal warmth. I can do that net present value over the course of many years and understand what is that present energy footprint because I own this heater. And so if I want to be carbon neutral, I can just simply buy carbon offsets as an example in order to be, that covers for this present energy footprint. Well, let's look at the passive building example, because a passive building itself is a plant property equipment. So we can put that into the PPE category. But if it's built really well, it's providing the thermal warmth over the winter without consuming any operational fuel. But I'm going to have to depreciate the asset over time, and that's a financial rule. And in all intents and purposes, then that depreciation is the only transaction that happens year over year. So that means that it's effectively the depreciation that is providing the warmth, the thermal comfort for that particular house. So then if I do the math at the bottom over the course of years, in year 0, I have the capital outlay for the passive house, and then every single subsequent year I depreciate it, I can still do that present energy value calculation coming forward. But in this particular case, I now have 2 options to become carbon neutral. I can buy my carbon offsets for sure, but what if I just use the house for a really long time? What if I use the house for 80 years or 100 years? I can just simply set the depreciation rate to equal the carbon absorption rate of geology, essentially. And if I do that, then I can just be carbon neutral by simply using that house for a very long time. And so this basically starts to show that when we're able to show this trade-off of operational and capital, as well as the duration and longevity, we start to get a lot more options of how we can have strategies to reach carbon neutral. So then basically my research plan and how I'm approaching this particular project is in these 3 steps. First, I'm doing the conversions. Okay, let's take all of these transactions. Let's figure out what's the operational component, the embodied component, and take the decisions and convert them into energy. How can we take all of those decisions and convert them into energy? And we might need a balance sheet and an income statement equivalent, but for energy. And so let's just call that energy statements. And let's call that a general accounting framework for the flow of energy. Once we create those energy statements, now we can start trying to compare different investment decisions to see then how impact. And so things like if we think of distributed energy resources where there's batteries and wind farms and solar panels, as well as demand side management of preheating thermal loads, preheating water loads, so on and so forth, we can now compare when to operate, when to deploy, but also when to invest in each one of those assets within a particular geographic location. And then lastly, once we convert, we compare, the third thing we need to, this might be able to help with, and I want to look at, is allocate. Because if I build a passive house, I lock in a different future energy footprint than if I buy a heater. And so depending on how I buy that and depending how I made that energy lock-in decision, how do we allocate the future performance based on the financial decision made today? And that's how we can then convert it back and connect it back into making financial decisions today that meet future carbon alignment. So in summary, When we think of climate alignment, we generally think of really large infrastructure projects. But what I want to think of is how these small, everyday, marginal projects look like. If we think of fixing a boiler versus replacing a boiler, which one of these two is most climate aligned for your situation? And we can't answer that today. In order to be able to do that, we need to come up with some of these new categories, and 3 of them could be operational energy, embodied energy in exchange, and embodied energy in use. And then if we can create a double entry relational database transform, we can then understand how each one of these transactions that we do on a day-to-day basis affects one of these 3 categories. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. That's very interesting. So I'll open up the floor to questions. So all 3 of the speakers we've just had this afternoon. In the chat. Firstly, for Vanda, how can regulation help in the creation of energy communities?
Regulation can help a lot. First, the main issue in our project is to solve residential sector and the deep retrofitting and energy conservation, employ energy conservation and energy efficiency measures. So as I said in the presentation, Clean Energy Package in 2019 put citizens at the core of energy transition, giving citizens rights to decide if energy produced on their premises will be shared or stored for their own purposes. For example, City County Cork in Ireland, they transposed the European Commission rules and published National Energy Climate Plan and Climate Action Plan in 2019, which sets targets by 2030 to establish 1,500 sustainable energy communities across Ireland, to retrofit 500,000 homes to B2 standard, to install 600,000 heat pumps, to ensure 70% reliance on renewables, which is now covered under Renewable Electricity Support Scheme for communities. Also to define the role of public participation network group, which gathers all these sustainable energy communities in one and provides support advices as a knowledge sharing. For example, also in Bulgaria, one of our partners in Asenograd, their state set a decree of councils of ministers, which stipulates mandatory establishment of associations of homeowners, because there prevail a lot of buildings, multifamily buildings with a lot of apartments. And this association participated in initiatives in the Bulgaria and assist them in retrofitting their apartments. Renewable Energy Directive in Bulgaria will be very soon transposed, I think this summer, June, July, so they will see how this will work and in couple with other directives and regulations that they proposed. For example, in Catalonia in Spain, they have a lot of issues with their public sector law that hampers many activities, these collective actions. And the royal decree is also, I think it's transposed in, it will be transposed in June. It was transposed in June 2020. They define, this decree defines renewable energy communities, but regulations are not so clear and misconcept. So the state needs to work a lot on this. In Upper Austria region, they are experiencing significant frustration due to the lack of possibilities to make use of excess PV production. However, 2 weeks ago, they launched a new energy community initiative, which supports the development and implementation of energy communities. So we are very happy about that. This is in short. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I saw that there was a question for Vera in the chat that's been answered about asking about the kind of long-term impact of COVID and people working from home. I wondered if you think that there'll be any bounce back in that, so people are perhaps used to travel on public transport, if they're now making the shift to kind of traveling by car because they didn't feel comfortable on public transport. Do you foresee any kind of bounce back following following pandemic?
Yeah, so that sounds like that seems like a really interesting question about, okay, perhaps people changed their habit during COVID and they decided to take the car transport for safety, health and safety reasons. Is that it? And that people would stick with that habit? Is that the question that you're asking there?
Yeah, so people not wanting to go back on public transport because they don't feel comfortable.
Yeah, and this, so just referring to a study that I have read is that particularly in this one case study of a country, China, they looked at they actually found that there was an increase in car ownership in the country during the COVID-19 pandemic because people realized, okay, to be safe, I need car transport and take the car. And also at the same time, from other studies, there is also the biggest predictor of car use is car ownership. So now that people own the car, they're more likely to use the car. So yeah, I think that will be something that will be really, really interesting and worth keeping an eye out and seeing, okay, so into the future, has car transport changed? Unfortunately, I think we will have to wait a couple of years to see the longer term effects of COVID. In the short term, we have seen in Ireland, we've done some modelling on this, looking at how traffic counter data has shown that there was a reduction throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, this is temporary and very short-lived based on the unprecedented travel restrictions that we had here in Ireland. And including all of those changes, it came to about, as I mentioned in the chat, about 3.9 megatons of CO2 emissions reduction over the two years. And as modelers, we don't expect this to be long term at all. We do expect that this would have a fairly significant bounce back, and this, I suppose, is also informed by how past historical events have impacted transport demand. So there has been two cases that we often look at. It's the 1970s oil crisis and also the 2008 recession, particularly here in Ireland. There was a dip in transport demand, and then it recovered pretty much by 2013, 2014. So even though at the moment it might seem like, everything's changed, there does tend to be in the spectrum of time, there does tend to be quite a recovery for transport demand. So then looking longer term, could car transport be increased as a result? Well, you'll have to counter that against all these other confounding factors that are happening at the same time. So increased urbanization means people are more likely to take, or it's more feasible to take public transport. There's also an aspect of the climate action plans, and also as well carbon taxes being introduced here in Ireland. And I think it's very much we're going to have to wait and see for the longer term impacts of COVID, but hopefully with some good strong policies and urban planning, that perhaps we could counterbalance whatever prevailing car transport increased trend is due to people fearing for health and safety reasons as a result of COVID and deciding against going to use public transport.